Okay, well, I think it's turned over to me. This is Alan Levy. I'm the director of the Goizeta Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Emory, and I'm chairing the clinical task force that you heard a lot about this morning. I thought I'd better introduce myself because I'm giving the opening few comments for the data core session now, our brief 30-minute update. And the NIA asked that we just take a pause given the robust discussion this morning about all the things we heard about, how COVID's affecting our thinking about what needs to be collected and how it gets collected in the clinical cores, and how the clinical task force sort of got redirected from starting to work on UDS4 to a lot of work over the last month or two, working on how we need to adapt in the short term. So first, on the slide, you can see the committee members. You saw a version of this earlier this morning from Cindy. I want to thank Greg, Cindy, Lisa, and Andy for doing a lot of great work leading the two task groups that you see here for neuropsychology and clinical measures. This group, along with the members, and also great thanks to Nina, Cerise, and Grace, and at the NIA, everybody's been putting in a lot of extra time on top of a lot of extra duties given the pandemic and how everybody's trying to adapt. So there's been a lot of thought, a lot of work, and this is an important session for us today because we really want to make sure that the clinical task force gets broad feedback from everybody. And so we look forward to input so that we can finalize recommendations. We hope this morning you got a sense for where the task force is expecting some of the recommendations to land. And I think you saw a few examples where we still have a bit more work to do. Hopefully we'll disseminate very soon some thoughts that Lisa Barnes put together around the COVID questionnaire that we think is important to collect. We heard about that for a variety of reasons, everything from health disparities, the impact to potential impact on biological mechanisms and disease trajectories to caregiving and the like. So we realize we know that there's a great interest in trying to harmonize and have some uniformity in how the data are collected, as Greg talked a lot about this morning. Also Cindy mentioned in reviewing the guidelines this morning that we developed for the clinical task force that we think many of the principles are relevant for these short-term adjustments that we're discussing in the interim phase during the pandemic. Really primary in everybody's mind is we want to value and sustain the legacy that's been collected over several decades. And so as we think about changes in the short term or longer term, the task force has this right at the front of mind. I can assure everybody, I know there's a lot of discussion and concerns about that. And we know that a lot of the heavy lifting that needs to be done now really falls to the to NAC. I want to thank Bud and his team for being patient with us as we've been developing draft recommendations, because they are very anxious to begin working on changing the forms, changing the database to accommodate these and the new forms such as COVID-19 surveys. So thanks, Bud. I'm going to turn it over to you and to Heather Allure, who's going to walk through some of the issues, touching on the things that were mentioned this morning about the task force deliberations and considerations. And then we'll be available for questions. So I'll turn it over to Bud.
Okay. I just wanted to run through a few of the steps just so you know that what we need to do once all of these different things are laid out by the clinical task force and all agreed to by everybody. Then we'll go back through and verify the content. Some of this is really made simpler for us because a lot of the instruments are have either been in use already in the main UDS or have been in use by Suzanne's team or Murray Sano's team already. So we'll be able to prepare the forms and guidebooks or MOPs or whatever we want to call them, and instructional worksheets as needed and so on. We'll probably be able to do that relatively fast. The longer part will be constructing the database itself, the data templates and the database and the programming for that and the data submission system. So what we'll try to do first so that you can begin to use things is to basically prepare these forms to get them ready for you and distribute those so you can begin to collect data from people, and you won't get you won't be losing time on those sorts of things. And that while that's going on, and while you're collecting data and maybe piling up these forms, and while your own data core is working on programming where they go, we'll be working on our system as well. And then after a while, I'm not sure how long it will take, perhaps a month or something like that. We haven't got a good estimate yet, but we'll let you know. And then we'll actually roll out the data submission system with with usual sorts of error checks and that sort of thing, so that you can begin to submit the data, and we'll probably have that available for you to do either directly or in batch mode. So, but we'll give you more details on that as we move along. So I think that's basically it. It's there's always a delay between the deciding what the content is and preparing the forms for use in the field, and then actually having the database ready to go. So I just don't want you to get too worried that we won't have it ready. We will have it ready, but the database part will take a little while, and I'm sure all the data cores know that their work on that end will also take a while. So anyway, we'll try to be whatever help we can to move that process forward. And that's basically all I wanted to lay out, just so that you could tell, what our process is. I don't have actual dates to put in for timeline. One thing that I should mention here is, it was mentioned earlier about the missed visits and so on that show up on the monthly report, and that check, the missed visit rate and so on, is primarily linked to just checking on adherence to the annual protocol. So we wouldn't expect any like missing data, really. What we're really concerned with, especially in the short term, is just that we have dates on everything so that we can link the times between visits. We're not going to worry at this point about if you miss a visit that we have to think about missing data indicators or something like that. It'll just be, you'll submit the data when you can and try to adhere to the protocol, but we'll also put notes in the monthly report, recognizing that this is the COVID-19 pandemic period, and you may be off protocol for that reason. That's really about all I needed to say. So maybe we can move on to Heather.
Hi, everyone. My name's Heather Allure, and I chair the Data Management and Statistics Core's Steering Committee. Next, please. So this is just basically a recap that we heard from the clinical task force earlier today. This is kind of sharing from the data core's perspective. So the data cores have had a series of phone calls together, the leaders of them. And so we've been trying to prepare and anticipate and kind of share some information among ourselves, and also just kind of bring some questions to the discussion. So we've heard there's going to be the revised UDS-3 telephone packets that may either be through some sort of video or telephone administration. Earlier today, Dr. Barnes shared with us that they'll be including information about COVID-19, and it's some sort of new form in a revised packet. And we heard quite a bit from the clinical task force earlier today about the TCOG battery that's being adapted for administration in our kind of remote ways. And that estimated time to perform is about 30 minutes. So next slide. So one of the things we heard was that the NIA and the clinical task force had really encouraged digital audio recording and the secure sharing of the sessions with the participant so that there could be quality assurance and suggestion of future item level psychometric analyses. One of the concerns that the data core leaders brought up was about the need to set up new audio storage and retrieval, because between the kind of the suggested TCOG battery of 30 minutes and the additional tests that may be another 30 minutes, we're looking at an hour per participant per visit. And depending on where a center is based, we really need to determine how secure audio can be recorded. We know some centers, as we heard earlier from folks that are doing audio recording in their different projects, but not every center is doing audio recording. So when we're trying to look at things across centers, because we are trying to be really a unified system, that may be much easier for some systems than others. And we also just really want to be mindful that there's certainly going to be places where interviewers are working remotely, and so this may be more difficult for the infrastructure of those sites to have the secure recording of the information. So we also are aware that this is going to change the storage needs. There's a cost to storage needs, because these could be some very large audio files since it's an hour of recording. And we'd really kind of like to get some feedback on how long these files are expected to be stored. Next slide. So this again is a summary of the clinical task force. So earlier we heard about the TCOG battery. I won't go over it. They did a fantastic job going over it. We heard about different recommended tests and what some centers are doing and adaptations. And we also heard earlier about the auditory verbal learning test, that the RAY is going to be recommended and put in a format, but certainly every site is able to use their own forms, and how that's going to be captured and transmitted in other formats is still to be discovered. So next, please. New participants. So we also heard from Greg earlier that they're looking at revisions to an initial visit package to accommodate new enrollment and assessment from the data core's perspective, as well as NAC. That means, okay, we have to be kind of developing all those forms and undergoing all the training. Next, please. So earlier in the day, actually relatively early in the day, I think when Bud spoke in the morning session, there were some questions about the Milestone Form. So that was a place that we were really thinking we could capture several of these data recording, and since we'll be moving into some sort of remote telephone packet or telehealth form, that would be a place where we have the UDS status. What is the new status? Why are they not doing the annual interview? The reasons are really quite different. So here we suggest why there would be a new status, to have a COVID related options for the reason of change from the in-person. We, I think, are in agreement with the Neuropath core to update the options for why the autopsy is unavailable, and also to add more options for why the person may being dropped. And that then these can be mirrored because it kind of triggers the telephone package. By doing some changes to this one form, it may address how that's linked to many forms and be very efficient. Next slide. So we got some great feedback from the Neuropath Core Steering Committee. So we just before us, we heard that we may be expecting fewer autopsies to be performed. And so there were discussions about modification of their NP version 10 form. Suggestions included having information about their COVID testing, when was it done, prior or after death, things about the tests. So these would be obviously vetted and worked through the Neuropath core. Then each center would, of course, be building these up with guidance through NAC. They also were suggesting to have some COVID risk factors. And the next item really is about that kind of milestone form, to have reasons why an autopsy may have not been conducted. And then overall, they wanted to integrate data fields about RTIG. Next, please. So one thing that the data cores have been aware of is that this is putting a very heavy load on NAC to have the capacity, the person power to be able to certify all these electronic forms. So when centers, so there may be, these are what the forms are, but each center may use different software to electronically capture and upload information, and that those are then certified by NAC. So we're aware not only do they have to create all these, but there is a lot of work they go through when they certify new forms, and that there's really quite a few changes that they'll be facing. There was discussion about using paper forms prior to the electronic forms being certified. Some ADC data core leaders shared that their centers don't use paper forms at all. So this would really create some challenges in workflow for them, because they've totally moved away from paper entry, and so they're not really set up that way anymore. There was also suggestions, and I'm sure other groups have looked at this, but individual items, there may be differential responses, such as questions about anxiety, that there could be more anxiety during the pandemic and it may be kind of signaling just simply the uncertainty of the time we live in. Next, please. Then, of course, we are also a statistics arm of things, so we did want to just very briefly touch on some statistical considerations. Earlier today, we heard about privacy and bias. Really great to hear how LinkedIn and OnQ, our colleagues, are about these issues. So I think we heard a lot about the biases that might arise from cognitive testing in home or in different sorts of formats. But we did want to at least really bring to the table that the statistical concerns about having a potentially longer interval than typical is much less than some may be feeling. So it really does have to be a particularly wide time interval where the average time for a participant to develop, the event being a change in cognitive status or some sort of change in a biomarker, it has to be really quite large before we're going to have much loss of efficiency. So we're aware that these efforts are primarily to retain individuals, to keep them connected, but we do want to try and assure people that most of the longitudinal methods that you're using are not going to have a lot of loss of statistical efficiency. We heard some earlier today about harmonization, but it is something that the data core would like to be involved in these discussions, especially if there's different choices of tests being used in different centers. How are those really going to be harmonized? We've also heard about earlier today that there are challenges when we did not kind of have this planned rollout of these tests. So the how putting in this different format in a kind of unusual time is going to kind of represent the same value on the different sort of instruments that we're used to measuring. Doing it kind of post pandemic obviously is a consideration, though possibly there could be some sort of changes in certain responses after this experience of the pandemic. Next slide. So just some really quick conclusions. There were some questions about quality control. That was one of the motivations of the digital audio recordings. The data core leaders recommend, just as sites have been always undertaking their own quality control for all the different things they're doing at all the different sorts of experimental designs, whether observational or trials, that can really, we think that the sites are set up to do that. And we also think that the optional tests may have some challenges in being harmonized, and that we totally are supportive that the choice of the version should be site specific. We just want to echo what Bud said right before this talk, is that some of this is going to take a little time to roll out. One, we have to kind of have that final results of what's going to be changed, what's going to be a new form, what's going to be a revision, whether that has to go through individual IRBs or consent changes. That may vary by site. Again, the certification, training of personnel of how to administer this, as well as all the individual site software changes and storage changes, as well as if we have to do secure audio or audiovisual storage. We think just a few changes to the Milestone form can actually capture a lot of the things that have been brought up. And lastly, the long intervals really will have a minimal loss of efficiency. So that's all I really have to share. I'm very grateful that you invited the data cores to participate in the spring meeting. We usually are only at the fall meeting, so I'm very grateful to everyone. I'm very thankful that the clinical task force has done the heavy lifting, and we look forward to continue to work with them. I've really appreciated the feedback from the Neuropath core steering committee, and we're all looking forward to also integrating those changes. So thank you.
I think we have a few minutes for questions. Cerise, I don't know if you want to take control and moderate.
Yes. Joe Kramer wants to remind us about if we're recording the visits, the issue of subject consents. Do you have any comments about that, Alan?
Sure. The committee has just briefly touched on that and completely agree with Joel's important comment. It's going to be an important issue. Some centers, as Rhoda mentioned this morning, have experience and have already made it clear that they would be more than happy to help share, disseminate best practices and experience with practices. And I think you saw really a lot of consensus this morning in the survey that Greg did, that there's really a call for flexibility and making things optional as much as possible too. So, we recognize that some centers are going to have more challenges than others with some of the recommendations.
Alice had a couple of questions. I'll start with one. I think it's for Heather. The suggestion for milestone changes, try to generalize the language regarding COVID-19 in case the virus comes back next year under a different name.
I agree, and obviously it is NAC that will be overall decision makers on these forms and the language that will be used.
Her follow-up was, how will we document the route of administration for the telephone package? Will there be a new variable added to each form? Will there be an option to administer some of the forms using telehealth and others over the phone in case there's issues with connection during the visit?
Again, I think this is really a NAC issue. The data core leaders were suggesting that the milestone form should be used and specific questions should be available, and that the form of the telephone form, possibly the aspect on the milestone form of why a telephone could be triggered, you could add in that if that center was doing telehealth versus a teleform, and then they could then have a logical sequence of either why that's being done, if that center has multiple access ways, why they chose that one.
It seems that Mary might have a comment or a question. Mary Sano? Or is that an old hand? Might be an old hand.
I don't see a mic.
You just called Mary old, did you, Cerise?
No. So Suzanne Hunt said the milestone form isn't really tied to a visit. Is that correct?
The milestone form is used when, in the current, before we had the pandemic, the milestone form would be used when a person was going from an in-person interview to a telephone contact. And so within that, then there would be a reason about why was the person going from the in-person to the telephone. And so it usually had to do with some sort of limited capacity of the individual to attend an in-person. Now, if we were moving en masse to a telephone, those reasons won't all apply. So that's why capturing information in the milestone, then you could always know why the format was one way or another. Because there would be some people, regardless of the pandemic, that would be moving to a non-in-person interview.
We could probably also put indicators on the on some of the new forms themselves that are going to be used for the, like the TCOG or some of the other supplemental data forms that would indicate reasons. I mean, those will be different forms generally, so that might be possible there. I think one issue with the milestones form is because it's not tied to any visit. A lot of times Milestone's forms aren't really kept up to date at the centers, or they're kind of submitted, you know, when things get around to it. It might be different now, but sometimes we're quite a ways behind on Milestone forms. So we'll try to figure out the best we can when we get the full set of the data when we put it on forms, so that we're able to try to put together some more or less fail-safe way that we can identify in a couple of places maybe what the reasons for one type of visit or another might be indicated.
Thanks, Bud. That's all the questions. I was going to let Julie wrap it up.